Hello, and welcome to another discussion in our series on early modern philosophy. And today we are going to be looking at some of the metaphysical work of Anne Conway. One of the things that's been going on among historians of early modern philosophy for the last dozen or more years is there's been some work on expanding the canon. For instance, when I was an undergraduate taking classes in early modern philosophy, there were some deviations, but oftentimes an early modern course would involve looking at a core of perhaps 5 to 7 philosophers. You would most certainly see Descartes, and then at that point you would probably see Locke, Leibniz, Spinoza, Hume, Berkeley, and Kant. Those were the sorts of figures that you would read. So within that big 5 or 7 figures, that's what a curious student learning about early modern philosophy would learn about. One notable thing is that there were women doing philosophy during the 17th and 18th centuries. As we've already seen, there were people like Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia who were formidable interlocutors with figures like Descartes. Now, what I will suggest here is that Anne Conway, though only having recently been discussed in a broader sense in early modern philosophy, had interesting things to say. Things just as interesting to say, for instance, as what Leibniz was up to. And in fact, we can also note that Conway was in fact quite influential on Leibniz's own work. So Leibniz read, respected, and admired Conway. Speaking of dogs and this wonderful painting, pardon the noise that the dogs in my house just made. So here's the plan. I will quickly situate Conway historically. And my focus here is going to be from Conway's work, Principles of the Most Ancient and Modern Philosophy. And we're going to be looking at a couple of chapters that speak to questions about the metaphysics of mind. So Conway's big claim is that the nature of every body is life or spirit. And in this way, I'm going to suggest that Conway is arguing for a vitalist, arguably panpsychist version of monism about mind and body. I'll explain what monism, vitalism, and panpsychism are in a moment. And briefly at the end, we will note some ties with the monadology by Leibniz. So where does Conway fit into the history of things? Excuse me. Well, on this little timeline, I've roughly charted out the lives of different philosophers that we've looked at so far. So here's Descartes, born in 1596, lives until 1650. We've got Elizabeth Hobbes. Hobbes lived an awfully long life. Leibniz. Conway is here. And there's Spinoza. So we can actually see that Conway was around at the same time as Leibniz and Spinoza. And if we look at her book, Principles of Ancient and Modern Philosophy, it was probably written in the 1670s, so during the last decade of her life. But it wasn't published until 1690, so right about there. And we'll notice that this is a book that comes out before Leibniz's monadology, which is all the way out in 1714. And we will notice that, we can back up this fact that Leibniz read and respected the work of Conway. Okay, enough with the history. Here's the big claim that we're going to be thinking about today. Conway says the nature of every body is that of a life or spirit. Think about how different that is from what Descartes was telling us. Descartes told us basically that there are two kinds of things, the mind and the body, and they are utterly distinct. Right? So this idea that there is mind in physical things, and we might even say there's a physicality to the mind, is a quite different view than the dualism that Descartes proposes. So, whereas Descartes, the dualist, is going to tell us that there are ultimately two kinds of substance, two kinds of being with independent existence, Conway we can think of as a monist, in the idea that she's going to think that there is one kind of substance. So we don't want this sharp bifurcation between the mind and the body. So being material, and sometimes we'll see corporeal or even corporality, and being spiritual, when she talks about spirit or spirituality, we can think about that in terms of mentality or thought. These are two attributes of that one kind of thing. Now, we can also notice from this claim, so we've got one kind of thing, and in that one kind of thing, we have body, which is also with life and spirit. So vitalism is just the view that there is life in everything, right? So we might even say, like, even, this guitar pick that's sitting here on my desk, well, we could say that it is made of living things, right? So everything has some life in it. Even this guitar pick, or maybe we could say, like, it's made of things with their own spirit or matter in them. This might seem crazy in one sense. We can say, like, look, we certainly know the difference between an unalive thing, like a guitar pick, and a living thing, like the dogs that are scampering about the house right now. But we might notice that if a thing has its own principles of action, right, if it moves itself, well, then there is a sense in which it has liveliness. This actually goes back to the ancient Greeks, right? So, for instance, Pythagoras, I believe, would claim that, well, magnets have life to them because they have internal principles of motion, right? This is the idea that there is a certain amount of life in everything. And, to bring it back to contemporary science, we might say, like, look, atoms have electrons orbiting a nucleus at the speed of light. And in that way, there is sort of like a liveliness or a self-motion in everything. So everything has some life in it. We can also notice that she's claiming that everything has some spirit in it. That is, there is mind or thought or consciousness in everything. In contemporary philosophy of mind, this is a view that some philosophers will defend. The idea that there is mentality in everything. So contemporary panpsychists like Galen Strawson will tell you that there is a sense in that there is a what it's likeness of like being an atom or an electron, right? So in everything there is a certain amount of thought in it. And I'm going to suggest that this claim that there is in every body, that is every material thing, there is some life, that's the vitalism, or spirit, that is panpsychism. There's some mind in everything. On this view, Conway is going to be arguing against the view that we can think of matter as this dead, inert stuff, separate from minds and souls. So Conway is going to give us 4 reasons for this claim. she's going to say that instead of thinking in terms of a binary, we should think about these as different properties, like mindiness and physicality. These are a matter of degree, and everything is going to be on that spectrum. And that things can convert. They can become more bodily. They can also become more spiritual. So mind-body is a matter of degree. Second point, Conway is going to tell us that we can know that the mind, or that life, is in everything because of this idea of God's communicable attributes. So we'll learn some things about what a communicable attribute is and how that can help us understand how there is life or mind in everything. 3, we get a very peculiar, kind of fun argument that the desire of a soul for a body is based on a similarity or kinship between these things. And 4th, Conway is going to suggest that this relationship between mind and body, that they interact in a certain way, gives us reason to think that they are of one substance. So let's run through these arguments. Here's the first one, that body and spirit, these are different properties, Conway's going to admit, but the difference between these properties is more so a matter of degree. So if you go to page 249 of the reprinting of the Ancient and Modern Philosophy in our anthology by Lascano and Shapiro, here's the first line of thought. She's going to say, look, God is ultimately a spiritual being. Now you might think, so that's why we should think that material things are utterly different than God, right? But she's going to say that no being that is created by God is in every way contrary to God. And here's a line of thought that Conway gives. She says, nothing can become darker and darker to infinity, although it can be brighter and brighter to infinity. So, in fact, I can think of an example even in my own house. We had a light bulb burn out in a fixture that was on a dimmer switch, and it turned out that, in our house we were not so happy with the brightness of that bulb. So it was like you could have the bulb off, or you could move the dimmer switch up to here, and the dining room was still kind of dark, right? But we bought a new light bulb, a new LED bulb, which was supposed to be equivalent to 100 watts rather than 50 watts. And now when we turn on the light, you can have it off, or you can have it up to a certain level of brightness. So we have a new range, right? And the thought might be, look, you can keep on getting stronger and stronger light bulbs, right? So in a certain way, you've got the off position, and then on the dimmer switch, you could go further and further and further, and maybe until you're off the chart, right? So the idea is you could keep on putting stronger light bulbs into the fixture, conceptually, at least speaking, and you could have the light coming out of that fixture become brighter and brighter and brighter and brighter, right? So this is the sense in which things can become brighter and brighter to infinity, but we'll also notice that there is a maximum level of darkness. So you can never get to the maximum amount of light, but you can max out the dark just by leaving the light switch off, right? And Conway is going to think about being a spiritual being in a similar kind of way, right? So there's the spirituality of God, and everything is going to have a little bit of spirituality in it. We might think of God as the maximally, infinitely spiritual being, but you can't have infinite opposition. There is what we might think of as a least amount of spirituality, but there is not a maximum amount of spirituality. Just as there is no maximum natural number, but there is a lowest natural number, right? We can also say spirituality, God is infinitely spiritual, but there could never be anything that is infinitely non-spiritual. So in order to make this argument work, we have to think about spirituality as this always improvable state of being. And we might think of its opposite, materiality, as sort of a whittling away, but you do get to a maximum unspirituality, let's say. So when we start thinking about state changes, Conway is going to say, look, she's going to say that a human soul can become more or more spiritual, or it can also become less spiritual and more physical. She gives an interesting example. She suggests that human emotions like pain and torment, those are going to activate life and spirit in you. So if you are feeling pain, that's going to make you jump and move away from the painful thing. And she's going to say that in that process, that reduces, she uses the word grossness, I've seen in other translations of Conway, almost the word like lumpiness. So the physicality and an increasing physicality comes into beings that are more focused on the body or bodily pleasures. But it always seems that pain and life spirit are always like activating you away from physicality. She also makes this suggestion that even if things seem to be loose and disconnected, they have a certain amount of physicality that you can't perceive in them. Again, she seems to be foretelling some of the insights of atomic theory when she says, like, look, at its base, what is water made of? Well, it's actually made of small hard things. Even though water is loose and splashy when it's in a swimming pool, at its most basic level, it's made of hard things, right? And she's going to notice that when we start thinking about state changes, we can start to think about materiality and non-materiality as more of a spectrum than as a binary. Here's a second line of thought that Conway's going to give us. She's going to point out that we should think of ourselves and every other material physical thing as having some mind or spirituality in it because of this idea of God's communicable attributes. So when we're talking about a communicable attribute, here's how I like to think about it. A communicable attribute is an attribute of a thing, and that is an attribute that will be passed on to the other things created by that thing. So when you search for communicable attributes on Google or something like that, you will find that it's almost always discussed in the context of God. And here's the simple line of thought. There are features of the things that God creates that are also features of God himself. But we can notice this in terms of other things. So we might notice that you could have a thing, say like your liver. Your liver is a physical thing, and the products that it will produce, so whether that be enzymes or simply cleaned blood, let's say, it is a physical thing that produces physical products. So we might say that physicality is a communicable attribute of products of something like your liver. Or here's another sillier example. Some attributes of a being could be communicable through the law. So here's a fact about me, is that I am a Canadian citizen. Now, if one day I become a father, that would mean that through the law, any child of mine will automatically be entitled to Canadian citizenship. So we might actually say that Canadian citizenship is a communicable attribute of natural-born Canadians. Right? So here's this idea. There are things that bring other things into being, and we can notice then that the qualities of the creating being are qualities that are then shared by the created being. So Conway's going to tell us that when we think about God and God's nature, Conway's going to say that God has spirit, light, life, goodness, holiness. And God is going to create other beings, and all these created beings are going to have some of God's attributes. So that's just what we mean by a communicable attribute. And Conway is thinking about it in this way. Well, some of these qualities of God are going to be communicated into God's created beings. So a thing will have always some goodness in it just by being a product of God. We can also say that spirit, light, life, goodness are also properties of things with life. And God has eternal life. That's the line of thought here. And we might say that not only does God have life in him, but we can also say that God's creations are going to have life in them. So as Conway puts it, a being with this eternal life could not create a being with complete lifelessness. You could not make a dead thing if you are a thing that creates with eternal life. The thought being that life is a communicable attribute of God, and as the creator of all things, all of the creation is going to have some life in it. Conway says, suppose that, completely dead matter. Well, could we say that there's any property that it shares with God? Well, this is a really interesting claim that Conway makes. She's going to say, no, that's not enough similarity between God and the created thing. So she's going to really insist that God cannot make a completely dead thing. Somebody says, well, couldn't God and the created thing just share the property of existence? Maybe that's the communicable attribute? What's really interesting is that Conway makes the claim that existence is not a real property. She's going to say further that it is a concept in human minds. Now, she's making this argument in the context of, arguing about what communicable attributes God has. But we should notice that this is a claim that Immanuel Kant, it's one of the most famous Kantian claims. Kant famously argues that existence is not a real predicate, and he uses this claim that existence is not a real predicate to critique the famous ontological argument developed by Anselm, in which we see a version of in Descartes' Fifth Meditation. So, in fact, Conway beats Kant to the punch by many decades by making this really insightful claim that when we talk about the properties of a thing, you can't really talk about existence as a property of a thing. That's more of an abstraction. And we wouldn't want to make the claim that God has this property of existence, which he shares with all other existent things. Now, it is true not all the properties of God will pass on to God's creation. So Conway says God doesn't share the property of changeability with the things that God creates, right? And we might notice in other examples, so if I become a parent, my child might be male like me, but my child might be female, right? So we might say that maleness is not necessarily a communicable attribute of dads, right? And we might say that when God creates things, he's not creating perfect replicas of himself, but he's creating partial creations that share some but not all of his qualities. And he's going to note that like material things in the world are going through changes all the time. And as Conway thinks of it, they're going through changes where they're improving themselves and becoming more spiritual over time. She can also use this claim to point out that utterly dead things would never endeavor to improve themselves. So just the fact that everything is in this state of change is going to, at least according to Conway, add some support to her vitalist claim. Here's yet another line of argument that begins on page 253 of our edition. And this is Conway's claim that a soul desires a body. If you think about yourself and the way your body works, your body has a bunch of impulses and desires that help you keep your soul and your body connected and working together. Well, Conway's going to point out that things that are similar desire one another. So when a parent has a child, you might notice this. There are even people who say they don't much like kids, but then they have children and they say, well, I still don't much like kids, but I like mine. Right? Or we might also notice that animals of the same species tend to move together. So my dog gets more excited and more happy when he's in the presence of other dogs. It gets excited and moves towards them in a friendly way, as opposed to squirrels or cats, which is a much more, how would I put it, adversarial relationship. You may have also heard this saying, birds of a feather flock together. That goes back at least as far as the ancient Greeks. Right? It's that things of similar kind are attracted to one another. So the soul and the body desire one another. Your body is moving towards keeping you alive and also keeping your mind and consciousness running. Conway is going to use this observation as evidence that, well, your soul and your body, in the way that they cling together, it's kind of like birds of a same species flocking together. She also points out that men and women desire one another. Unfortunately, within the context of that discussion, she makes some claims that are perhaps heteronormative, maybe even homophobic in one passage. But she says that, well, there is a sense in which when men and women desire to be close to one another, we can use that as evidence that they are ultimately of a similar kind and of a similar substance. Now, in this way, we might say, like, yeah, things of a similar kind, of a similar type, and of a similar substance have this natural attraction to one another. Well, if we can include soul and body among the set of things with a natural attraction to one another, then that would be further evidence that soul and body are of ultimately the same substance. Now, Conway brings in some possible challenges to her view that soul and body are one kind of thing, and I think her responses here are instructive. These responses are very much inspired by the Cartesian dualist approach that would have been prevalent and under much discussion in the 1670s when she wrote this. First claim, body has extension. This was one of the key ideas for Descartes' meditation, that when you think about what it really is to be a body, it's to be a thing with a shape and that takes up space to the exclusion of other things. But Conway's going to argue, well, actually, spirits, that is, minds or souls, have extension too. Here's one thing that we can notice. We can say that your mind is in a place. And we can also notice that, when you get in a car or you get in an airplane, it's not just your body that goes on the move, right? It's your mind that's on the move, right? So just like being in a place is like a hallmark of being an extended object, like there's an exact location of this pen, and that's a really great way of thinking about its physicality. Conway's going to say, well, we can actually start to talk about our minds in a similar way. Your mind is living in your body, and in that way it has a physicality, it has an extension, just like the atoms that make you up. Now, one thing that we notice about this claim of extension is also this idea that it's not just being in a place, but it's being in a place to the exclusion of other things. So the idea is like, look, not only does this pen take up a certain amount of space, but if I move my finger towards it, either the pen or the finger is going to have to give, right? They can't both be in the same place at the same time. And that's the sense in which body is impenetrable. So Conway's going to tell us here, actually, we have to think more carefully about this, because Conway thinks that, in fact, matter can be penetrated by heat. So her thought is that there is a certain kind of suffusion of fire into, say, a piece of iron when you put that piece of iron into the fire. Now, it turns out that she was wrong on her physics there, but we can notice in a broader way that material things can be interpenetrated by other things. You might think of how a sponge can, without changing its dimensions, be interpenetrated with water, right? And there is an important sense in which material things can be in other material things. So there is a dog in my house right now. In fact, there are 2 dogs in my house right now. And we can understand this is like, look, we have a material thing, we have another material thing in that material thing. And it's really a matter not of entire impenetrability, but it's about texture and density and whether there are inlets, right? So it is true that my house cannot be interpenetrated by everything. It could not be interpenetrated by the Sears Tower. Those things are just too large and they're not going to fit into one another. Conway's going to say, like, look, once we realize that like a thing can be interpenetrated by other things, she's going to say, when we think about a human being, we can think about it as a material thing. We could think of the corpse as a material thing for sure. And we could think of it as interpenetrated by spiritual stuff. As she puts it, finely divided spirits. So just like I can fit a dog into my house, I can fit a finely suffused soul through my body. And ultimately, these are similar kinds of things. Just like a dog is a physical thing and a house is a physical thing, we could say that a body is a physical thing and the spirit that interpenetrates it is a physical thing. Now, we also get this claim that only material things are infinitely divisible. Now, in your reading, you might have noticed this weird word, discernible. Discernible in this context, we can just think about it as meaning divisible, right? So just as this piece of paper is divisible in the sense that I can split it in half, we got this famous argument from Descartes saying like, look, you can cut a physical thing in half as many times as you like. You can never cut a thought in half, right? But Conway here is going to say you're double wrong on this. Not all bodies are divisible. So again, she might be partly capturing something about contemporary atomic theory. At some point, you can't cut an electron in half. It's just the lowest you can go in terms of divisibility. We might also notice that for a thing to be a thing, it has to not be divided, right? So we might realize that a circle stops being a circle when you cut it in half. Or, silly example, a taco would stop being a taco when you cut it in half. Then it would just be like half a tortilla with some fillings on top of it, right? So there is a certain sense in which not all bodies are infinitely divisible. Conway is also willing to admit, unlike Descartes, that minds are divisible too. She's going to say there are multiple spirits that make up a living animal. And this is going to be true even though consciousness is unitary. She gives a fascinating example here. She's going to point out, for instance, that let's say you are perceiving an object, and it's going to be a tree. And you're standing there and you look at the tree and you say, "Lo, a tree." And you might say you're going to have a thought of a single tree. So I've just drawn a thought bubble here. And then in your thoughts, you're going to have a representation of a tree in your mind. What's really interesting to Conway is like what's actually going on here. Because not only do you have one eye perceiving the tree, but you have two eyes perceiving the tree. So light is getting from the tree into that eye, and a visual signal is getting from the tree into that eye. And we might think that those are two separate sources of ideas for us, right? So you see one image with two eyes. And Conway even suggests that if you had 10,000 eyes, you would be getting a bunch of information, a bunch of different little bits of data, or we might even think of it as like ingredients of thought. And there is a sense in which we could divide those ingredients of thought up, right? And these things are going to collect together and then create a unitary consciousness. So you don't see two trees with your two eyes when you're looking at a single tree, at least not usually, right? And this is going to suggest that there is actually multiple things making up the mental experience of one thing. So in this way, Conway is going to say Descartes was wrong to think that thought is indivisible. Fascinating argument. But we can see how this line of thought gives us a way of thinking of mind and body as not having fundamentally different attributes, but they might in fact be living on the same spectrum. That's the view that Conway is pushing us towards. Now, fourth argument, and this will be the last argument that I'll look at, she also says that mind-body interaction should be seen as evidence that mind and body are one and the same thing. So one thing that she points out is that you need to have bodily organs to have perceptual experience. This is going to suggest that there is an inherent physicality associated with thought. And if you had no physicality in your body, you would never get any input or data. Maybe you would never begin to think in the first place. She also gives the example of a ship and a sail. So here she says that movements, right? A sail can push a ship when impenetrable things resist one another. Now, we might say that when the sail is set up in the right way, it is impenetrable by the wind. And the more impenetrable the sail is to the wind, the more that we have the sail here and the wind coming at it. Now, if some of the wind could get through, then we wouldn't get much pushing. But to the extent that it blocks all the wind, then that's going to push the ship along. She's going to say that there is a similar way in which we can have degrees of impenetrability, and those degrees of impenetrability can explain, for instance, how a mental event could, explain, like a wind moving a ship. A mental event could sort of interact with parts of your brain physiology and your nerves in order to bring about an action, like lifting your cup of coffee to your mouth. We get a similar line of thought that there is a certain inseparability of the mind and the body. So just notice that your mind is inseparable from certain experiences. So if I pinch myself on my hand right here, we might say that physical event of getting pinched is leading to a certain mental experience of feeling a little twinge. I wasn't pinching very hard, but there certainly was a mental experience that came along with that physical experience. That suggests a certain level of inseparability. And that level of inseparability suggests that we have a unified substance at work here. Interestingly, Conway makes two interesting but ultimately false biological claims. Now, we don't need to get hung up on the falsity of them so much as what we can learn from the line of thought that she's pushing here. So she suggests that new animals, how do they get generated? Well, you have a material thing that generates a living thing. And in some of her claims, she says, well, like rotting meat could sort of spring forth the existence of maggots or baby flies, right? So the thought here that we could have like animals coming up through meat or dirt or dung, she suggests that this happens. And she thinks that this is only going to work if there is life in the first thing in the first place. Now, maybe a more defensible way of putting this is like, look, you only get life from living things. And at least that's the only way that we've discovered we can generate new life from a biological point of view, at least in our experience. So think about the fact that you are a living thing. Well, the things that made you up were eventually living things in the first place. So you originally had your origin in a sperm cell and an egg cell. Well, sperm cells and egg cells are living cells themselves. So you cannot create life sui generis. So even though she makes some weird claims about living things springing straight forth from dirt, it's a little more complicated than that, she might have a point in this line of thought that suggests that you cannot get a living thing out of an utterly dead thing, right? Your origin, for instance, wasn't from utterly dead things, but it was from a living egg cell and a living sperm cell. So this idea that we can have generations of living things directly from matter is a strange claim. One of the other ones that she makes is that if you have some standing water sitting there, fish will just automatically generate from the water. Again, not actually how it works. You need to get some eggs into that water somehow. It just happens imperceptibly. But Conway is going to say that if living things were being generated directly from matter, that would be evidence for her vitalist view, that there is life in everything. So, the line of thought that she's working at here is that it's a mistake to think of souls as this one kind of special thing, and to think about matter as this ultimately inert, dead stuff. And she's given us a number of lines of thought, right? So we had mind-body interaction. We had an undercutting of the Cartesian picture of minds as indivisible and non-extended, whereas bodies are extended and always divisible. We have this desire of the soul and the body for each other. We have the communicable attributes of God. An eternally living thing with its communicable attributes couldn't make an utterly dead thing. And this further line of thought that mind and body isn't a binary, but it's more of a spectrum. So in this way, Conway has some certainly challengeable, but nonetheless very interesting views about how we could develop a non-dualist and instead develop a monist theory of what the mind is, what the body is, and how things interact in this realm of minds and bodies. Now, we'll just end by thinking about how Conway compares with other philosophers. And one of the other big philosophers that people will encounter who offer a view on mind and body in this monist point of view is Leibniz. So in this video series, I will not directly cover this famous text, but you may have heard of Leibniz's book, The Monadology, right? Basically, Leibniz is going to tell us that there are monads with life and spirit directly in them. And notice some of the things that Leibniz says. He says, from this we see that there is a world of creatures, of living beings, of animals, of entelechies. You can basically understand that word to mean potentials. Of souls in the least part of matter. So he says, even in a little bit of water, you might have living things making up that water. He puts it, each portion of matter can be conceived as a garden full of plants and as a pond full of fish. So in fact, this idea of fish comes up in both Conway and Leibniz. This idea that there is life in everything, all the way down. As he puts it, each branch of a plant, each limb of the animal, each drop of its humors is still another garden or pond. So there is life in everything, and there is life all the way down. This ties in rather closely with Conway's vitalism. I don't mean to say that Leibniz just stole his ideas from Conway, because Conway had her own way of arguing about things, and certainly the view that she develops is not exactly the same as Leibniz's monadology. But what we can say is that Leibniz's admiration for the work of Conway may have had influence and may have helped him to work out his theory of, say, the monad. So we're going to end there. I hope what we found is, even though this is a lesser known and strange philosophical text in some ways, I think that we should also notice that it offers some pretty interesting and powerful arguments for a vitalist, panpsychist, monist view of the mind and the body. So thanks for listening, and take care.